All right, welcome everybody to our July edition of Winshuttle WEBtips. Let's go ahead and get started. We are just a little bit after the hour, so we'll go ahead and jump right in. So for those of you that are new to our topic, Winshuttle WEBtips and Tricks is presented by Clear Process Solutions, and it's our way to help keep our customers up to date on some of the latest things that Winshuttle is offering, and offer some best practices and make sure that you're still really productive with the tools. So that's what Winshuttle WEBtips is about. Every other month we do it on desktop tools, so transaction and query, and then the other months we work in form and workflow. But sometimes it's related to SAP, sometimes it's not. But this particular time, we're going to talk about transaction and query with respect to using them in a form a little bit, as well as trying to use other data sources other than Excel and Access as a way to load transactions. So, oftentimes people have information stored in SQL databases, Oracle databases, and we're going to look at a unique way to get that data as a source for transactions. So that's the agenda for today, and then at the end, if we have any time, we will open up the lines for any discussion, ask any questions. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is regarding transactions. So using a SQL database as a source of data. So as you're probably quite familiar with already, let's see if I can bring up transaction here. Most of the time, you only have the options to have Microsoft Access, Excel, or XML forms. But what about data that's in a database that is not one of these things? So using Access sort of as like a middleman, you can do some cool things with Access to access the data that's in your other database, be that an Oracle database, a SQL database, or some other database. If it's an ODBC connection, you can link them together. So that's what we're going to look through today. So I have a transaction script. So let's go ahead and open up the transaction scripts. All right, so let's see where we're at here. I think I misplaced my transaction script, so not a good start. But let's take a look at the database here. So in my database, this is my SQL database. I have a table called load. So we're going to be using this to load information from the database. So inside here, you see I have a list of materials. The same plan, I'm updating a bunch of materials in a plan and then giving those items a description. I also have my MRP Controller code, and there's a log field. So why might you ever want to have this data in a SQL database anyways? Well, maybe you're getting information from a different system, and you have some kind of job that transforms it into SAP-ready data, and you need to get that in there. But there could be too much information for Excel, or the system doesn't spit out an Excel file that you can use easily to go ahead and run it out of Excel. And it takes extra steps to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at using that as a data source through Access. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a new Access database. Okay, we'll create a blank database on the desktop, and we will call it SQL Test 2. And go ahead and create that. All right. So we need to get that data from SQL into Access, but I don't necessarily want to download it all. So what we can do is we can use the External Data tab, and we see this ODBC database. So we're going to go ahead and select that. So we're going to link this database to the Access database that we're creating right now. And the option we want to use is link to the data source by creating a linked table. Import the data import the source data into a new table just brings that data from the database we're trying to connect to and brings it local to this access database. That's not what we want to do. We want to create a live link to this database through access. So we're going to use the link data to the data source. And we're going to go ahead and go through the steps to create a new data source. So we're going to select SQL Server. This is our driver that we're going to be using. And then we're just going to follow the steps to create that connection. I'm going to give it a name. All right, and the server we want to connect to. Okay, so a dot represents the server name that's on the server, or if you know the server name, you could type it in directly or an IP address. So we'll see if this works for us. Okay, we're going to use Windows authentication. The database we want to use on that server is Yoder Test 1. And I think that's all we need to do. Test our data source. Successful. All right, so now we have our new data source set up. And it's going to ask, okay, what tables do we want from a section? So we want load. We'll select load and then hit OK. We have to provide some unique record identifier, so material and plant. In this case, is going to give us a unique combination. All right, so here I have this linked. I'm going to close table 1 here. I have this linked table. So you can see it has a little globe and the little link icon. So this means that it's a live data connection to that database. If I go ahead and open that up, you can see the data that is in that database. So I'm going to go ahead and update the log field just to the letter A. Okay, so I've updated that first record. Now I'm going to go back to my database. And let's refresh that. And you can see the log field has been updated with an A. So access in this case is just acting as a middleman in order to make this happen. All right, so let's get back to our transaction script. I was on the wrong computer. That's what the issue was. And I'm going to have to close this database. Okay. Transaction slowly coming up. All right, so the transaction finally came back. What we're going to do is we're going to find the database that we're dealing with. Okay. So in this case, I'm going to open up a new database. Should be, I believe, in my documents, SQL Test 2. All right, we'll pick our table, and of course we need to pick our log field. So since I created a log field in that section, we'll go ahead and do that. And we're going to run now. Now, since we're using access as the data source, you don't have the options to have a start row or an end row because there's not really a concept of a row number in the database. It's just a list of data. So you can't really provide a start and end row. So we're just going to go ahead and run it all. So I'm going to go ahead and hit test. Log into our SAP environment. Okay, and while that's running, I'm going to keep refreshing our database here. Okay, so as it starts making updates, hopefully we should see the log field in the database updated. The connection did not work. All right. Always some good live demonstration issues. So we'll go back to the database that I used when creating this example. And we'll go ahead and use that one. It's the same concept. And we'll try again. All right, so it looks like it's processing. Go back to our server. And you can see that even though we're using Access as the data source for transaction, we're really updating the SQL database directly. So as I'm refreshing here, you can see the log field is filling in with the results. Okay, so we were able to get through all of that information. So it took 32 seconds to run those 9 transactions. So oftentimes you have large data sets of data that you don't want to use Access because that's not where you want to store it, or it's too big for Excel, or it's not readily available to get down to Excel. Plus, you want to feed that information back up to that other system. So in this case, we have a SQL database. Now, we're not using it directly as a data source. We're using Access as our middleman, and we're able to put those log results back into that SQL database. Then if you had a daily batch job that looked at what was updated or something like that, you wouldn't have to worry about importing that data back into the system and spending that time to do that, and any errors that could come along the way. So in this case, again, just to repeat what we've done, is we've used an Access database. We'll bring up the Access database again. Then we have our table that we link to. And then we see the log field here. So we link to that table using the external data ODBC database. And the first thing we did is we created a database connection, and that connection is stored locally on your desktop. So it's just a little file that contains information about how do I connect to that database through Access. And then after we've linked that in there, we pointed our transaction script to that database. Now when you're recording and mapping, more specifically when you're mapping that transaction, you want to open the database, or maybe like a development version of that database, to make sure you're mapping to the right columns. Because when you're using Access, the table name gets mapped into the transaction as well. So if we look at the mapping of this, for those of you that haven't done a lot of Access mapping, you can see here I'm mapping in the material number, but the mapping, instead of just column A like you would in Excel, it'd be column A, B, C, or D, or something like that. When you're using Access, it has table dot material. So you have to make sure that the table name that you're using during your mapping is the same table name that you're going to be using during the load. Now that doesn't mean it has to be the same database. You can still pick a different database, but the table name has to be the same. So again, if you're pointing to a development version of that SQL database, you would have that same structure in your QA and your production environment. So that's going to be okay when you point to these other systems. It's the table name that has to be the same. And the log field can vary from time to time. Even though the table shows it's selectable here, it's not going to work if you don't have the right table selected. So it has to be the same name once again. All right, so that's a little bit of a tip and trick around using other databases. Again, this will work with any database that you can link to through Access. So any ODBC data connection you can get to, Oracle, SQL, any of those items will work. Okay, so let's see what we have going on here next. All right, so we're going to integrate a little bit with Composer, using Composer as a method to interact with scripts. So with Composer, you have a little wizard that can walk you through creating a form and workflow. You can say, okay, I want to use the wizard, and it's going to say, what's your name, and all these other questions that you're familiar with. And usually the wizard helps you along with what information you want to bring into that. So let's go ahead and do an example with that. So in this case, we have a transaction script to create a customer. So inside, let's go ahead and open that script. So tips for July, we have XD01, create a new customer. And in this case, I'm pointing to an Excel file. So I'm going to go ahead and open this data file. And I don't think I have the right location. So So we'll go ahead and change the file. All right, let's go ahead and open that one up. All right, so in this case, we have your standard transaction, type layout. Row-based data, we have, each row is a new set of information. Every company on here is a different company, and I want to load these in with transactions. So this works well, and you can see the account numbers have been saved. I've already run this transaction in advance to make sure it's working. And if I wanted to use this transaction script in a form, I would use the same transaction script. The only difference would be I'm going to change my data source. So just like in the last example, we changed it to Access as a data source instead of Excel. In our next example, we're going to change it to a form because we're going to interact with a composer-based form to allow maybe a sales rep in the field. They're meeting with a prospect and they want to place an order, but in order to do that, you have to have a customer number in SAP. So a sales rep can pull out their cell phone, navigate to the form, on their mobile device and start filling it out and create a customer number in SAP. If that sales rep has the ability to do an XDO1 transaction. So we would select XML forms, and I'm going to save that as a different transaction. So I've already done that. You can see I have an XDO1 XML just to indicate that's my XML source. And instead of overwriting that, I'll just open it up so we don't cause any additional problems. All right, so it's the same T code. It's the exact same T code. The only difference is now you can see I have XML as my input instead of Excel. And I have a couple of hard-coded values in here to help bring the process along. So oftentimes the hardest part about creating a form is like, well, I have to get my transaction there, I have to create all the fields, I have to create the web service, I have to link everything together, I have to put a button on there. Well, using the wizard, you can streamline a lot of that information. So let's go ahead and open Composer. All right, I'm going to create a new solution. So the key here is to create a new solution from this menu. All right, so I'm going to give it a new customer, if I can spell today, customer create. We'll call it July, for July tips and tricks. Okay, on our form site, I'm going to give it my SharePoint site. And then because we're dealing with the transaction script, we're going to have to load this transaction script into Central as part of this process. So I'm going to also pick my Central SharePoint site as well. All right. So with the wizard, you can all set up your swim lanes right from here. I'm going to skip all the swim lanes because I'm not going to really route anything. I just want to show you how I can do importing with the wizard. I can add a data connection if I want to bring in a SharePoint site or something like that. If I want to use the SharePoint list to connect to, I can do that right away as well. So we'll use that, my SharePoint site. And because I'm dealing with customers and addresses, I know I have a SharePoint list out there that gives me some information on states. So I'm going to bring in that SharePoint list as a state, the abbreviation, and the region. So region is important to my sales process, so I want to make sure that the sales rep is picking the right one. So I have a one data connection, no field packs, and now we can import the transaction or query script. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my transaction script that we were looking at. So if I look at July, where's July tips? Okay, and I have my XDO1 XML transaction. And it brings that right into my wizard here. Now I have to provide some more information on it. So I'm going to give it a group name. So this is going to be a form field group name. And I don't want it to be a repeating section because I'm only going to create one customer at a time. All right, so I've imported my transaction script and I'm all done. I'm going to hit finish. All right, so let's take a look at what the wizard did. The wizard provided me a generic workflow with the start and the end. Didn't give me any additional swim lanes because I didn't put them in there. But on my form, you can see that all the fields that I'm using in my transaction script. So if I bring up my transaction script, we'll try to see both screens here at the same time. All the items I'm mapping in are already available on my form now. We see name 1, search term 1, street, postal code. So again, everything that has an XML input is now already on my form. So I didn't have to do a lot of design work to get those fields on the form. Now, are those fields in the pretty state that I want them in with the right names? No, they're not, but at least they're on there, and I can easily update descriptions and sublabels and things like that. So also created a web service control, and pointed to my T code that I have loaded in there, my transaction script, and also provided a button. Okay, so I have this button, and it's linking this web service to the button. So if I wanted to, I could publish this right away, and it would work. I could put in a name and address and phone number and hit button 11, and it would create. Now, again, it's not in the final state that I want. I'm going to go ahead and do some reorganizing here, but the intent of this is to show you how quickly, using the wizard, you can create a form with the transaction script. All right, so in this case, I don't want it to be just one column. I want this to be, let's say, 4 columns. All right, so it rearranges everything here a little bit. I have name. Let's give it a better name. And we'll call it search term. I'm just really cleaning up some of the underscores that they provided. Zip code, city, country key. Okay, you get the point there. So we're going to move some of this information around. All right, so I said, I have a data connection that I want to use. I want to use that state. So here I have my state field, so I'm going to call this state, and I want this to be a drop-down. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to switch it from a text box to a drop-down. I'm going to select the range option and use from data connection. So because I created that state data connection right at the beginning, I want the user to be able to select state, but I want the value to be an abbreviation. Okay, so the abbreviation is going to be the SAP ready version of that. Okay, so now I have a drop-down. But I told you regions are going to be important to my process as well, because I want the sales rep to select the region and then the state that is in that region. So I'm going to create a new drop-down. We're going to give it region. And the source of this is also going to be that same data connection I just created. But this time I want the value to be region. And I only want to show unique labels because in my states table, which we can look at here real quick, my state SharePoint list, you can see I have the Great Lakes region multiple times. So if I was connecting to this data source and didn't check that box, unique values, I would see in my drop-down Great Lakes 6 times. So I have my state associated with a region. So we're going to give it that. All right. And let's move region up here beside state. All right. So I want to make sure that the state is based upon the region. So in my range, I'm going to filter. I'm going to provide a filter where the region is equal to the new field that I just created. Okay, so the region in my form is going to be equal to the region in my SharePoint list. And I'm going to add a quick rule. So when the user selects region, we're going to reload the drop-down values of the state. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and publish this real quick. It's not the prettiest thing in the world right now, but you get the idea of how you can easily manipulate the fields once they're on here. So go ahead and go to my solution manager. Check my deployment profile to tell it what SAP client to use. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and publish that. All right, so that's already deployed. We're going to go ahead and find that form in my form library. We call it customer, create customer July. Go ahead and launch that. All right, so we already have some information here. Let's give it a copy of that. New customer Z. Give it a search term of WEBtips. And we'll call that. Okay. So the country is US. Region. Okay, so I have to pick my region first. There's no states to select from because I haven't first selected my region. So I'm going to say, okay, it's a Great Lakes state. And now I have Ohio in there. All right, if I picked West Coast, now I have different states that are available. So by selecting the first drop-down, it repopulated the value of the second drop-down with the list of the list that's relevant to that section. So I'm just going to put in my phone number real quick. And my email address. And with any luck, when I press this button, this is going to load in there. All right, so now it's connecting to SAP. And maybe creating a new customer, or maybe giving me an error, because I'm sure this is a duplicate address in there since I've used this one a number of times. Okay, so a new count number was created. So in about 7 minutes, about 7 or 8 minutes, we went from our transaction script to a form that interacted with SAP using the wizard. So again, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it gives you a starting point. You know, in relatively short fashion, I had my web service. I had some what I call cascading drop-downs, where you select one value and then it populates the list with the other values that are relevant to that selection. And we organized it a little bit. We gave it some new names. All of that was pretty easily done by using the wizard. So it's pretty easy to take your transaction script that you've already created for customer create or material master create or journal entry loading or clearing of accounts, whatever your key code may be. Using the wizard, you can quickly take that transaction script and put it into a form and have it available for use in a short amount of time. Okay, so that's one of the great features that Composer offers with their new wizard. Okay, so moving on from that, but sort of staying in the context of Composer with scripts, how to properly set up a repeating query web service in Composer for single results. So when you're using query, it's not too often when you're using it from an Excel version, you know, when you're downloading data to Excel or downloading data to Access, that you want to get information for just one record or one record at a time, right? You want to get information in mass. So like dump down all this data to my Excel file so I can create this little report that I need or make a decision or clean up some data and then send it back in with the transaction script. But when you're in a form, you're generally not dealing with that mass amount of data. You're dealing with a small number of records, maybe even one, maybe a couple, a material that exists, single material that exists in 5 or 6 plants, or a single customer that's extended to several sales areas. So you're not generally dealing with massive amounts of data, but you still might want to get information about that single bit of item. So you're going to use query to contact SAP to go get that information. But in a form, if you're only expecting one result, so that's what I'm calling a single result, you don't want to be using a repeating element. It's not too convenient. So I'll show you exactly what that means. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Composer form, and we're going to import the query script into that process. And we'll show you the difference about how the wizard reacts when you're using query script versus the transaction script. So the transaction script is very good with the wizard. It created almost exactly like I wanted to, minus some name changes. Query is a little different. I don't necessarily, depending on what your process is, if you need a repeating query, I would say more specifically around if you need a repeating query, the wizard may give you a little bit of difficulty. But if you don't need a repeating query, then you'll be okay. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new new solution. So I'm going to say new, and we'll go from the wizard again. I'm going to go July query tips. Give it my form site. And then again, my central site. And we'll just move along through this process. I'm only going to load a transaction to query script. Okay. So July tips, I have my query script. I'm going to go query some information about MRP controllers. Okay, we're going to call that, give it a group MM, and we want it to be repeating because I'm going to go get information one at a time about the list of materials. So that's what we're going to call repeating. Okay, so I've created my form in my workflow as I did with the wizard. Now the interesting thing here is that this setup is very, if you look at the output, that one query, it's only using two input fields. I'm going to give it material and plant, and it's going to output my MRP controller. But in this case, you see the repeating content is in a different section than the input. Okay, so I want to be able to repeat this process. So this setup may not be the best setup for me if I have a repeating query. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete what they put on there. Okay, and then I'm just going to drag in my section, and we'll see if this works. Okay, this is the setup that I was looking for. So with the repeating web service, I have my repeating section here, so the box around the repeating section, and within that I have my results. Okay, so the results, the output, query, if you query, you might get multiple results. That's why the results or the output, you see the output data here is repeating content. So if you get more than one result, it's going to fill in this information here. Now, however, in my case, I'm going to be at this part of the process, so say I'm in step 4 of my form and workflow, I'm going to have a list of materials and plants, and I need to go get the MRP controllers for them. Well, I want it to be part of my single record. Okay, so I want it to be, I don't want this repeating section here. I want it to be all sort of lined up. So this is how the setup would be for a repeating query if you have multiple results. Now, if you want a single record, I'm going to show you how to set that up. So let's say at the end of this, we query some information. We're going to get the MRP controllers on these materials and plants. And then we want to be able to change that MRP controller and then use a transaction to load it back into SAP. So if we had a record, speaking of transaction, we would have to create our transaction with a loop in order to use this repeating table. But when you're updating one record with an MRP controller, it's not a loop like you're creating a bill of material with many line items or a sales order with many line items. A material master, when you're updating the MRP controller, is not, you're not looping through anything. So this setup is not going to work for a transaction. So let's figure out how we can do that and still accommodate querying the records. So it's very good to use the wizard to import just to get an idea of how the setup needs to be. Because the setup for interacting with a transaction or query scripts is very specific when using repeating web services. And just so everyone understands, the repeating web service is a transaction or query script in this context that you're going to run many times when you press the button. So if you have 5 line items, it's going to run the transaction once for each of the 5 line items. So 5 materials and 5 plants, 5 rows of data. It's going to execute MMO2 once for each row. So it's the same web service, but it's repeating itself over that repeating table. That's what we mean by a repeating web service. So when doing that, this structure is very important. So we're going to remember that. And even this field name is very important too. So we're going to go back to our solution, and we're going to import the same transaction. I just named it different. We're going to import it a second time and do a little bit of a different layout. Get MRP Controller 2. Oh, I forgot about this. It doesn't like bringing in multiple queries in this version. So we have a little product bug. All right. So we're going to do something a little different here. We're going to quickly start it over. Okay, create a new solution. Query tips. All right, we want to make it repeating. MM. And we're going to finish that, and we're just going to go ahead and publish this real quick. After I delete this and bring it back in. Okay, so let's go ahead and publish that now that I got the layout restored that I wanted. So we're looking at the right SAP environment. Looks like we're good there. I'm going to go ahead and deploy that. And make sure we publish our scripts. Okay, so it's deployed. Let's take a look at the form. Oops. All right, so going back to my form library. And we call it July WEBtips, July Query Tips. All right, so this checkbox is what's going to allow the web service to execute on that row. So if you have 5 rows and the checkbox is only checked on 3 of them, the query web service is only going to execute on those 3. So you have the ability to control which ones are going to be, which rows of your repeating table are going to be queried. So I'm going to say, I didn't rename my fields, but equal to op that's the material, and this is going to be the plant. And let's go ahead and run this web service and see what we get. All right, looks like it came back, and we have, just one result. As I mentioned, when we're just querying one material master in one plant, we're only going to get one result. So this repeating table here is a little bit confusing. If I wanted to load this with transaction and change my MRP controller to maybe 001, then my transaction script wouldn't work because it doesn't have a loop in there just to load this one item. So let's take a look at how we would set that up to accommodate both the query and the transaction script at a multiple level. Okay, so here we are. Let's try this again and import another query script. See if we have any better luck this time with bringing in our second one. There we go. We're going to give it a different group name because I want the fields to be just a little bit different. Okay, just say MM_1. And I want it to be, that's not what I want to show. So we brought in our transaction. We're going to manually create the layout that we want. Okay. So we're going to create the tree structure manually to replicate what the wizard has done. We need some of that in order to make our next query script and our next transaction script work. So we're going to select the top node and say add. And here we're going to create MM_1. It's going to be the name of the group. We want this to be a group. And just like it did with the first one, that's not a repeating table. Okay, so now we're going to select that. We have to specifically add repeating content or inputs. We need to add mm_1 inputs. And this is going to be a repeating group. Okay, so now we have the layout that we need, and we need to put this allow run in there. That's very important. That's that checkbox. So we're going to add a field called allow run. It needs to be mm_1 allow run. And this is going to be a true false. So we can change it to a Boolean. And the default value will make it true. Okay, so now we have that layout that we need, but we don't need all these subfields and all this repeating output. We just want to be able to add a single, we don't want this to be our output to be a repeating table. So we're going to go ahead and add a few more fields in this section manually to make this work. So we're being very specific here about how we're setting this up. So we're going to add material, and then we'll add another one. Plant, MRP Controller, and then we're going to have two log fields. We're going to have one for a transaction and one for a query. And our query log field. All right, so let's create a new form group. And we'll bring this down here, and I'm going to have as a repeating table. Where'd my new group go? Okay, so there we are. We have all of our fields that we created. Now we're going to go back to our solution, and we're going to map in our query to those fields. So let's create a new field mapping. Call it mm_1. We want it to be repeating. We're going to create that field mapping. But we're going to map it to existing values. So we're going to have material, plants, and our log fields for query, and then our output is going to be the MRP controller. Okay. So we have that mapped in there. And let's give that a shot. First, we also need to create our web service. We'll just switch this web service. Use MRP Controller 2. Invoked by the same button. Okay, profile set up right. We'll go ahead and deploy this. All right, so if we go back to our form, we have our new information here. So the true is the same as the checkbox. When you check this checkbox, that means true. So we're just going to go ahead and, this is the text box. I could have changed it to a checkbox if I wanted to, but we're going to go ahead and put in our material. Maybe they were all set. Hopefully they were not all set as true, false. That looks like it kept my setting from the first one. All right, hopefully I think I got all the ones I wanted to change. We'll go ahead and redeploy. And let's see if we have any better luck this time. All right. So that MRP controller is going to be our output. So we're not going to put anything in there, but we're going to add another one to see what the MRP controller is in other plants. And we'll give it one more. And we'll see what kind of luck we have here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and run that with our button up here. All right. So you can see what it did is that it put the results directly in the row. Sort of the screen jumped up there so we couldn't see it, and maybe I can push that up there. But what it did is it executed the query 3 times because it was set to true. It executed the web service once using this material and plant, and then it brought back the results. And then it executed the query again against this material and plant and brought back the results, and so on. Now I would be able to use this to implement my MRP controller update. So let's see if I can quickly bring that into our solution here. I just published that, so we're going to go ahead and bring in our transaction scripts. All right, let's see if I can find that section. More importantly, if I can find my transaction scripts. All right. MMO2 MRP. I hope that's our one. Okay. So we want this one to also be a repeating element, and we want to use the same group MM_1. That's going to be the field group that we're going to use. And we're going to map into our existing information, so material, plants, and MRP controller. Then we created our transaction log field. Okay, make sure we click use existing fields or it will create new ones for us. All right, so let's go to our form and let's just bring this section to the top. Maybe we'll have a better chance of seeing it. All right, so now we have our data and then our button. We're not going to use this section anymore. All right, so let's check on our script, make sure we're all set. Our SAP systems are okay. Go ahead and deploy this. And since we put a new script on there, we want to make sure we publish the scripts. You know what? I didn't put a button on there. There's no way to execute it. So let's put a web service. And we're going to need a button. Let's put our button in here. Oh, it's creating all the buttons down here. And we'll move this one to the top. Okay, so this button is the query, so we'll just give it a name that we can understand. And this one's going to be the transaction. right, so we have our second web service. Let's tie it to our transaction scripts. And it's going to be run by a button, the transaction button. Okay, so now I think we're okay. Okay, let's go back to our form this time. Hopefully it looks a little bit different with everything up to the top and with two buttons. Okay, there we are. So let's add our material in there that we've been using. Add a new row. I'm going to show you a little bit how this works as well. So if I leave that blank, I'm going to go ahead and run this query. And hopefully we'll see, now that we're at the top of the screen here, we'll see the records come in as the query continues. Okay, so notice because I didn't have the true here, it skipped running the query on that row. So that's the value of that allow run. And the name has to be very specific. It has to be the MM_1, which is the group name we gave the transaction script when we created field mapping, and _allow run. So it's very specific. If you do not have that, set up like that, it won't recognize that as the right field. So now I'm going to go ahead and update these MRP controllers. Let's go 000 and maybe 001. And again, since this is not true, the transaction one is not going to update it either. Let's go ahead and hit the transaction one. See if that one's working. Okay, so you can see it updated those two records as well. So if we went into SAP, we would see those two records updated. So the whole purpose of this exercise was to show you that if you directly import a query using the wizard, you're going to get, as a repeating web service, you're going to get a setup like this, right? You have a repeating section with results as a repeating table within that repeating section, which may be fine for your use case. But if you're thinking about, okay, I need to, in the big picture, what I'm trying to do is I need to update MRP controllers with my transaction script, but I need to go get it with a query first. So you have to think about the whole solution as a whole. So this repeating section with an embedded repeating table layout, that would not work because it's not conducive to your transaction. So by manually creating your setup, just the way you want it with a repeating table, the exact columns that you want, using the proper format. So if we have this kind of setup, it's a little bit cleaner than what we have up here. I'm not saying that this doesn't work in some cases, but I like to create exactly the structure that I want. But when you're dealing with a repeating transaction query web service, you have to make sure that you have this kind of structure. Anything else underneath this, these four items here, the group name, _input, and then the allow run, those things have to be there. Anything else, it could be whatever you like the naming convention to be, any field types, anything you'd like. But again, the key is when manually setting up, you have to have those four items. So this allows you to map multiple transactions, multiple queries, all to the same repeating table, in a very streamlined fashion. Okay, so that's that tip and trick about using query as a repeating web service when you're only expecting or working with one record at a time. So that's what we were looking at here. We had one record at a time that we were dealing with within a repeating table. Okay, so that wraps up all the topics that I wanted to cover today. I know some of them are a little lengthier than normal, but I want to make sure, a lot of our customers have both the forms and the transaction piece, so we want to make sure we're accommodating tips and tricks in those areas as well. So at this time, if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand on the GoToMeeting, and we can open up your line, and we can have a conversation. All right, there doesn't seem to be any questions out there for right now. But if you happen to think of any, feel free to contact me. Most of you have my email address already, or you can send us an email at info@clearprocesssolutions.com, I believe. And other than that, our next web tip series is going to be focused on forms and workflow. Again, not sure what the exact tips are, and that will be on, I think, August 20th. We're really going on the third Thursday of the month. So, look forward to seeing you guys on August 20th to talk again about forms and workflow web tips. So, all right, everybody, thanks again, and have a great day.